Nothing in my entire adult life prepared me for the day the Homeowners Association set my children's beloved treehouse ablaze. It happened so quickly, I almost questioned my own recollection. One minute, I was standing in our backyard, defending a whimsical structure we'd spent months creating together out of reclaimed wood and leftover paint. The next minute, flames, bright and searing, roared up into the leafy canopy, sending black smoke swirling into the suburban sky. I'm not naive. I knew there'd be trouble the moment I hammered the first nail into that sturdy old oak, but I never guessed I'd be stepping into a bureaucratic battlefield. Our neighborhood has had plenty of petty squabbles, fence height regulations, lawn ornament disputes, mailbox color fiascos. But apparently, the line in the sand was drawn at my kids having a place to let their imaginations run wild. In the eyes of the HOA, a brightly painted treehouse was a whimsical eyesore that threatened to disrupt their neatly groomed version of suburban harmony. We'd moved into the Autumn Creek neighborhood 8 years ago. Back then, it was a gentle place, or so we believed. The real estate agent had praised its strong sense of community and healthy involvement, but neglected to mention the lengths to which the HOA would go to preserve some intangible sense of uniformity. Truthfully, I suspected we'd but heads eventually. My wife, Lillian, and I are creative types, always tinkering, painting, or upcycling something. And our kids, Heather, 11, and Nate, 8, absolutely feed off that DIY spirit. They asked for a treehouse, so we built it piece by piece with scrap materials from my cousin's farm and leftover nails from a neighbor's old deck project. Right out of the gate, the HOA president, Melissa Hammond, let us know she disapproved. She sent polite letters at first, typed in that unassuming font that's become the hallmark of official condemnation. She claimed the structure violated at least 3 codes of the covenant. But it's not as though we just put up a ramshackle set of boards in plain view. We'd done our due diligence, ensuring the wood was stable, the nails were safe. We even placed the treehouse around the backside of our property so it wouldn't be visible from the street. The oak tree itself soared above the fence, so one might glimpse the top of the treehouse if they craned their neck. Yet, to the HOA's seemingly microscopic eyes, that was enough to brand us as troublemakers. Over the summer, Heather and Nate retreated to the treehouse with their friends, turning it into their imaginary pirate ship or spaceship or princess tower. Whenever I watched them from the kitchen window, my heart did a little leap. Their laughter was infectious, and for a few hours a week, they were doing what kids should be doing, creating memories and forging unbreakable bonds of friendship. That was 1,000 times more important to me than any perfect picket fence or uniform porch color. Weeks turned into months. The letters continued. They escalated from polite reminders to strongly worded notices of violation. I tried to reason with Melissa, inviting her over for tea. She came one evening with a binder of official bylaw documents. When we gently suggested that children need imagination and space, she didn't budge. Rules exist for a reason, she said, flipping to a dog-eared page. If we let you keep this treehouse, someone else might put a garden gnome taller than regulation height. It's a slippery slope. Yes, she truly compared my kids' safe, well-constructed treehouse to a rampaging wave of oversized lawn ornaments. I managed not to laugh, but I also saw the unwavering determination in her eyes. Whatever we said was going to bounce off that fortress of bylaw-laden resolve. By late autumn, I began hearing rumors. Melissa was meeting with the board's legal counsel. Some neighbors claimed I was ignoring the rules, painting me as the defiant homeowner who refused to follow community guidelines. But more troubling was the rumor that the HOA had plans to forcibly remove the structure. The sheer thought of it made my stomach churn, especially when I imagined them yanking it down in front of my kids. Lillian and I spent nights huddled in the living room, analyzing all angles. We weighed the cost of moving the treehouse to a different part of our property. But any place we moved it, the HOA would surely see it from a new vantage point and file yet another complaint. We could have dismantled it and tried to rebuild, but we believed that eventually common sense would prevail. We held out hope that if we could just get the right hearing or speak to the right person, we'd come to a compromise. That hope was dashed on a crisp Saturday afternoon. We just finished raking leaves out front. The kids were in the backyard, reading comic books in the treehouse. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine revving near the side of our property line. I ran around the back and found two men in safety vests hired by the HOA, hooking up a contraption that looked like a giant blowtorch. Melissa Hammond stood nearby, clipboard in hand. She insisted they had the right to remove the illegal structure. I can still see the flicker of fear in my children's faces as men in bright vests started to threaten our gentle oak. A shouting match broke out between me and Melissa. I insisted she leave my property. She insisted she had the full backing of the board to destroy the structure by any means necessary. In the heat of that argument, one of the hired men ignited the cutting torch, presumably to dismantle the wooden boards. But a spark flew. Maybe he jerked the torch the wrong way. Maybe the wood was too dry. Next thing I knew, fire leapt up the sides of that treehouse. I scrambled for the garden hose. Lillian dialed 911, and the kids stood on the grass screaming. The entire treehouse was engulfed in flames within minutes. A massive bonfire that consumed not just the wood, but my children's sense of security. The air sizzled with the smell of burning paint and scorched leaves. By the time the fire department arrived, most of the roof had collapsed in on itself. I watched in horror, powerless to save the thing that had brought my family so much joy. And Melissa, despite the fear that lit her eyes, looked more furious than sorrowful, as though she'd lost control of the situation. Little did she know the situation was about to spiral into a maelstrom bigger than any of us could imagine. The damage at first seemed limited to the treehouse. But once the firefighters sprayed down the embers and took stock of the yard, they found scorched branches, a blackened trunk, and a smoldering patch of grass that extended well beyond our property line. Part of the fence separating us from our next-door neighbor had burned away, leaving a charred, jagged gap. Embers had floated onto the plastic storage shed in the neighbor's yard, melting a corner of it and threatening more damage. Had the wind been stronger, we might have lost half the block. Melissa tried to downplay it all. She insisted the men had only planned to safely dismantle the treehouse by using a controlled cutting process. But how controlled can you be with an open flame and tinder drywood? As the fire crew continued their work, the neighborhood folks trickled out of their homes. Some neighbors were gawking over fences. Others whispered among themselves. It was hard to gauge who was sympathetic and who was outraged by the presence of the treehouse in the first place. Lillian and I felt helpless, standing off to one side, comforting the kids. Nate's cheeks were stained with tears, and Heather wore the hardened look of a child whose faith in adult benevolence had been shattered. One moment, her safe haven was there. The next, it was ash. Even in the swirl of my own anger, I felt a pang of something else, something heavier than frustration. It felt like heartbreak. I put so much love into building that silly, joyful little space for them, and it was gone in one fiery afternoon. The fire department spent the better part of an hour ensuring every ember was extinguished. A senior officer, Captain Wexler, approached me and asked for a statement. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a meticulous approach to his job. His expression was calm, but his brow was furrowed. I recounted what happened. The torch, the confrontation, the unanticipated ignition. He nodded quietly, taking notes, while Melissa hovered nearby, crossing her arms as though eager to refute everything I said. This was no accident, I insisted. They tried to remove the structure with a blowtorch. Who does that? Captain Wexler let out a heavy sigh. We'll collect our own reports, gather witness statements. There's potentially severe liability involved here. It was a loaded sentence. Although I was exhausted, I remember the flicker of hope it gave me. This might not end with just another stern letter from the HOA. Maybe someone in authority would finally hold them accountable. The entire scene felt nightmarish, but that sentence told me there was still a path to justice. That evening, the kids camped out in our living room, refusing to sleep in their own beds. I could hardly blame them. They were still trembling from the sight of their beloved hideaway, turned to ashes before their eyes. My phone pinged constantly with messages from neighbors, half of them offering condolences, the other half gossiping about how the Johnsons' radical disregard for rules led to a conflagration. Yet again, it was typical suburban rumor-mongering. Blame the victim for the chaos the HOA itself had unleashed. I was halfway through an email to an attorney friend detailing the situation when the phone rang. It was Captain Wexler, sounding weary. "I've been going through the official reports, and something's not adding up," he said. Melissa Hammond and her men were not only unauthorized to perform that kind of removal, they also failed to acquire any local permits or safety inspections. He paused. "I'm also hearing from the city's fire marshal that this might escalate." "Escalate how?" I asked, heart-pounding. "The fire department doesn't take kindly to unpermitted burn projects, especially ones that almost turned into a block-wide fire. These HOA folks might be facing a lawsuit if the city decides to press charges for reckless endangerment or public safety violations. Just thought you should know." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, letting that news sink in. A swirl of emotions battled in my mind. Relief that we might see justice served, anxiety at the possibility of an even bigger feud with the HOA. Still, my immediate concern was the well-being of my kids. Legal battles were for the adults to handle, but Heather and Nate had nightmares that night, waking up crying for their treehouse. My wife and I took turns calming them, singing lullabies like they were toddlers again. The next morning brought more tension. The burned-out oak looked haunting in the morning light, its branches bent, charred leaves covering the ground. Yellow caution tape, courtesy of the fire department, encircled most of our backyard. Heather stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the wreckage. Nate refused to even come outside. It was then that I noticed a small throng of HOA board members gathered in front of Melissa Hammond's house, 2 blocks over. She must have called an emergency meeting. The expression on her face was one of indignation, like a queen whose orders were misunderstood by her minions. I glimpsed them whispering and pointing in our direction. My phone began buzzing yet again, this time with messages from neighbors trying to glean our side of the story. Tired of rumors and half-truths, Lillian drafted a concise statement and posted it on the neighborhood's official social media page, laying out the facts. The treehouse was safe, the HOA's hired crew used a blowtorch, and the resulting fire destroyed the structure and part of the neighbor's fence. That's it. No editorializing. The response was swift and polarized. Some neighbors expressed outrage at the HOA's dangerous overreach, while the staunch rule followers insisted we brought this on ourselves by flaunting the bylaws. Meanwhile, the city inspector arrived on our property, surveying the damage with a somber expression, taking photos and scribbling in a notepad. He didn't say much beyond an occasional shake of his head. But as he prepared to leave, he muttered, "Never seen anything quite like this. The fire department's going to have a field day with these folks." Sure enough, we received an official notice within the week. Not us, specifically, though we were CC'd on the letter that the city sent to the HOA board. In it, the city's legal department stated that the HOA had violated several municipal fire codes, engaged in reckless conduct that threatened adjacent properties, and failed to file for any demolition permits. Additionally, the fire department was considering legal action for the costly emergency response and the near catastrophe that followed. The letter ended with a stern warning. The board members involved could be held liable for damages. When I read that letter, I experienced an odd mix of triumph and dread. My kids would never get their treehouse back, of course, but at least there was a glimmer of accountability on the horizon. Lillian held my hand as I set the papers down. We both knew that even if we won in court, the emotional toll on our family and the kids might linger for a long time. We spent the rest of that day cleaning up the debris. The charred remains of the boards, the half-melted tarp, bits of singed rope ladder. We piled them in a corner of the yard, uncertain whether to toss them or save them as evidence. Perhaps one day, I thought, we'd transform those charred boards into something symbolic, a piece of art maybe, something that would remind the kids that even in destruction, there could be something worth salvaging. At that point, I had no idea just how fierce the battle with the HOA would become, or how the fire department's lawsuit would rattle the very foundation of our neighborhood's harmonious reputation. The next few weeks played out like a twisted soap opera. The HOA board, clearly in damage control mode, put out carefully worded statements claiming they never authorized the use of open flame and that the hired contractors had acted on their own. Melissa Hammond went from denying wrongdoing to subtly suggesting that perhaps we had done something irresponsible, like leaving flammable materials near the treehouse, despite every witness statement contradicting her. The flurry of contradictory narratives only fueled more suspicion and gossip throughout the neighborhood. Every day, more letters arrived. Legal documents, disclaimers, notices from the city, and updates from a local attorney we'd retained on a contingency basis. Even a neighbor whose fence was burned filed a property damage claim against the HOA. Over breakfast, Lillian and I would sort through the stack of official papers while the kids sat quietly, glancing anxiously at the grown-ups. Our once peaceful home had turned into a battleground for accusations and defenses, all because of a children's treehouse. A critical turning point occurred when we received a subpoena to attend a preliminary hearing about the fire department's potential lawsuit. The city argued that the HOA had committed a public safety violation, requiring them to recover costs for the emergency response and to send a clear message that such reckless behavior wouldn't be tolerated. At first, I wondered if this was merely a formality, an opening step in a process that often ends with a slap on the wrist. But the city attorney's office seemed genuinely incensed. They compiled witness statements from neighbors who saw the torch, plus evidence of the HOA's repeated attempts to remove the treehouse without proper authorization. They had high-resolution photos of the scorched ground and references to bylaw clauses the HOA board had evidently ignored. Lillian and I attended that hearing, held in a small municipal courtroom with fluorescent lighting that gave everything a harsh clinical glow. Melissa Hammond was there, flanked by 2 attorneys, along with the rest of the HOA board. Several other residents were in attendance, either out of curiosity or direct involvement. Captain Wexler sat near the front, arms folded, as city officials laid out their case. The city attorney explained how the fire department was mobilized for nearly 3 hours, how the risk of a widespread house fire had been extraordinarily high, and how multiple property owners experienced damage from drifting embers. A hush fell over the room as these facts sank in. When Melissa's attorney spoke, he tried to spin the story. The contractors used a tool that malfunctioned. The event was an unfortunate accident. The HOA had intended only to remove a non-compliant structure in an orderly, lawful manner. But the judge, a silver-haired woman with a sharp gaze, pressed him. Are you aware of city ordinances requiring specialized demolition permits, especially for structures attached to living trees? He stammered, flipping through his notes. I believe there may have been some confusion about which permits were necessary. The association believed it was acting within its rights. The judge raised an eyebrow. Setting a structure on fire is rarely anyone's right. Melissa Hammond shrank in her seat, her usual haughtiness replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. Lillian grabbed my hand under the table, and I could sense her relief. Finally, a neutral authority was shining a light on the absurdity of it all. It felt vindicating, though overshadowed by the memory of that bright orange blaze and the tears on my kids' faces. Outside the courtroom, we caught up with Captain Wexler. He apologized for the ordeal we'd gone through. Had we known the HOA planned a forced demolition, he said, we'd have directed them to the proper channels or stopped them outright. This never should have happened. He gave us a curt nod, like a man tired of watching preventable disasters unfold on his watch. Back in the neighborhood, opinions began to shift. People who'd initially disapproved of our treehouse started to admit that the HOA's response had been extreme. One neighbor, Mr. Harper, a retired engineer who once complained about our holiday decorations being too flashy, stopped by with a homemade casserole. I didn't see eye to eye with you on the treehouse, he said, but burning it down? That's insane. I'm sorry you folks went through that. It was a small gesture, but it reminded me that hearts can change when faced with blatant injustice. Meanwhile, the children tried to move on in their own ways. Heather found solace in writing short stories about imaginary forts and kingdoms. Nate began drawing pictures of a futuristic treehouse that he swore we'd build someday. This time, higher and with better defenses, he joked. The remains of the charred oak still stood in our yard, though we'd had an arborist come out and assess whether the tree could survive. He delivered heartbreaking news. The intense heat had severely damaged the trunk's vital layers. The tree might endure a few more seasons, but it would likely succumb in a year or two. That revelation brought fresh waves of sadness, especially for Heather, who'd read enough nature books to understand the cycle of tree death. One bright afternoon, as we were raking up debris, our neighbor Harriet wandered over. She'd been living in Autumn Creek for decades, having purchased her home back in the early 1980s, before most of the current HOA board even moved in. "I'm telling you," she said, voice quivering with age, "this association used to focus on community gardens and block parties. It's changed. Too many power-hungry busybodies." She shook her head. "Don't let them bully you. Folks here need a wake-up call." Not long after, the wake-up call arrived in the form of official lawsuit papers. The fire department, with the backing of the city, was formally suing the HOA for the costs of the emergency response and for endangering public property. The text was unequivocal. The HOA had acted recklessly, violated local fire codes, and put dozens of homes at risk. The city demanded significant financial restitution and, pending the outcome, might push for criminal charges against board members who authorized the removal operation. It was bigger than I ever imagined it could become. For the first time since moving to Autumn Creek, I watched as neighbors stood at the sidewalk, reading the posted notice of a lawsuit. In our city, certain legal actions are posted publicly as a matter of record. Some looked shocked, others quietly gratified. A few were outraged that our community's dirty laundry was now displayed like a circus attraction. The HOA scrambled to hold emergency meetings, sending out more frantic letters. Melissa Hammond abruptly stepped down as president, citing health reasons, though the rumor was she resigned to shield herself from direct liability. A new interim president took over, an older gentleman named Paul Whitman, who quickly reached out to us to express his condolences. He seemed genuinely decent, if a bit overwhelmed. But whether new leadership would ease tensions remained to be seen. The lawsuit was real, the damage was done, and the question on everyone's mind was, could the fire department, and by extension, the city, really force the entire HOA to pay for what a few individuals had done? That question lingered over our once placid streets, painting everything with uncertainty. Even as I closed my eyes at night, I'd see orange flames dancing in the darkness. In the midst of it all, an idea began to form in my mind, something that blended heartbreak with resilience. If the oak didn't survive, we might repurpose its trunk into a sculptural memorial, a reminder to all that communities are meant to foster safety and creativity, not stifle or destroy it. It was just the kernel of a plan at the time, but it gave me a sense of direction, something proactive to cling to while the legal gears turned. I hadn't anticipated how deeply that plan would resonate with the neighbors who still believed in what Autumn Creek could be, or how it might unify a subdivision that had nearly torn itself apart over a treehouse. The court proceedings that followed felt surreal, as though we'd all stepped into an alternate universe where an overzealous HOA could set a kid's fort on fire and end up battling City Hall. Yet there we were, packed into a municipal courtroom with attorneys on both sides, plus a small audience of curious onlookers and local reporters who sensed a juicy story. For weeks, the legal dance went on. Depositions, motions, new evidence introduced. Captain Wexler testified on behalf of the fire department, detailing how the firefighters found no evidence of any safe demolition plan, and that the situation posed a genuine risk to multiple homes. At times, the proceedings got technical, delving into city codes, fire safety regulations, and disclaimers about living structures attached to trees. But the highlight, if you could call it that, was watching Melissa Hammond try to explain away her role. Her attorney attempted to shift blame onto the contractors, claiming they acted outside the scope of their instructions. However, an audio recording surfaced from a neighbor's security camera, capturing Melissa's angry tone as she reportedly shouted at the contractors, "Then just burn it off the tree if you have to." The moment that clip was played in court, a wave of realization settled over everyone present. There was no doubt who had sanctioned the flame-throwing fiasco. In the end, the judge ruled in favor of the fire department's lawsuit. The HOA was found liable for the firefighting costs and the property damage to at least 2 neighboring lots. Multiple board members were placed on probation by the city's homeowner association oversight body, forced to resign or barred from future board positions. While criminal charges were considered, the city ultimately settled for stiff fines and mandated community service. In other words, the HOA itself had to pay, and, collectively, the residents would share the burden of that payout. It was a bittersweet victory. Yes, the city recognized the injustice of what happened. But as for the money that would change hands, it meant that the rest of the neighbors, many of whom had no part in the fiasco, would end up paying increased dues or special assessments to cover the legal penalty. While some argued this was unfair, others saw it as a collective lesson in reining in power-hungry boards. From my standpoint, it was a necessary step to ensure that no other family had their property destroyed under the guise of maintaining neighborhood standards. The question remained, how would our family heal? The kids spent the winter grieving the loss of their special place. Sometimes they'd sit together, drawing pictures of the old treehouse, whispering about the fun they'd had. Lillian and I tried to lift their spirits, day trips, new hobbies, or hosting their friends for indoor craft sessions. Gradually, the nightmares lessened. Heather immersed herself in her writing, penning stories about sky cities built in magical trees that never burned, while Nate poured his energy into Legos, constructing elaborate rocket towers that soared even taller than the real tree house ever had. Spring brought new growth to the yard, even around the blackened oak. Tiny green shoots sprouted on a few branches that managed to survive. Our arborist cautioned that the tree was on borrowed time, but still tried its best to cling to life. One afternoon, Lillian and I shared a quiet moment beneath that old oak, reflecting on the year's events. The bark was scarred, cracked, and blistered in sections, a stark reminder of the day everything changed. But we felt grateful, too, grateful no one was hurt, that the fire never spread beyond our fence, and that the city took a stand for safety and fairness. With the lawsuit settled and the HOA leadership in disarray, a grassroots effort began among some of the more community-minded neighbors. They wanted to reform the association's bylaws, making them less draconian and more focused on genuine neighborhood well-being. A few individuals even approached me with requests to serve on the new board. I politely declined at first, feeling that I'd had enough HOA politics to last a lifetime. But Harriet, the longtime resident who remembered the good old days, pulled me aside one weekend and said, "If you don't join, who will make sure this never happens again?" Her question gnawed at me. I spoke with Lillian, who reminded me that while the treehouse was lost, we still had a stake in this community. We had a voice that could help shape the place into something kinder, safer, and more imaginative for all. After all, once the dust settles, people don't remember the petty arguments or the paperwork. They remember whether they felt they belonged somewhere. So, a month after the final gavel in the lawsuit, I accepted a nomination to the new HOA board. We held open meetings, invited every homeowner to voice concerns, and started rewriting sections of the covenant that had been used to micromanage personal expression. No more demonizing harmless additions like whimsical gardens or children's forts. We developed guidelines for safe, family-friendly structures in backyards, along with explicit rules requiring board approvals to follow city protocols. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a significant step forward. During one of these open sessions, I unveiled my plan for the old oak tree. Working with a local woodcarver, I wanted to preserve part of the trunk after we inevitably had to trim it back. We'd shape it into a sculpture, a tribute to creativity, childhood wonder, and the resilience of nature. The woodcarver, an older woman named Delilah, volunteered her services after hearing our story. She proposed carving the outline of a treehouse into the trunk, surrounded by carved leaves and small birds. A living memory, she called it. The board approved the idea, and neighbors began donating funds and volunteering to help. On a sunny Saturday, we gathered in our backyard. The arborist carefully removed dying limbs, leaving enough of the trunk to serve as a canvas. Delilah got to work, chiseling away with skillful hands. Heather and Nate watched from a safe distance, occasionally offering suggestions or pointing to details they liked. As the carving took shape, it felt like a communal healing. People who barely spoke before chatted about their own childhood hideouts or shared stories of silly HOA conflicts. Harriet passed around lemonade, a neighbor brought cupcakes, and for a moment, our yard felt alive with a sense of unity we hadn't seen in years. By late afternoon, Delilah had carved a small wooden plaque along with the treehouse design. It read, "May we build each other up, not tear each other down." The words brought a lump to my throat. As neighbors marveled at her work, I realized that the story of our children's treehouse, though painful, had become a lesson that rippled beyond our property line. It was a reminder that communities need empathy and flexibility, not legalistic straitjackets. In time, the lawsuit and the drama surrounding it faded from daily conversation, replaced by typical suburban chatter about lawn care and upcoming garage sales. A new normal settled over Autumn Creek. The special assessment was levied to cover the fines, prompting a renewed interest in prudent leadership. Melissa Hammond vanished from the social scene, having sold her house and moved away. I occasionally overheard folks mention her name in hushed tones, usually ending with a remark like "good riddance." Meanwhile, the carved oak in our yard became something of a local landmark. Children would pause by our fence after school to peer at the sculpted treehouse design. Tourists or passers-by occasionally knocked on our door, asking if it was okay to snap photos. At first, the attention was a bit odd, but Lillian and I appreciated that others saw value in our symbol of resilience. As for Heather and Nate, they grew older, found new interests, and eventually new hideouts. Once in a while, I'd catch them glancing toward the tree trunk, a pang of nostalgia crossing their faces. Heather would run her fingers over the carved wooden boards, tracing the outline of the tiny door. Nate would pat the trunk, as though comforting a beloved pet. I knew, deep down, that the memory of the day their treehouse burned would forever be etched in their minds. But I also believed that seeing the trunk reborn as art helped them understand that even the worst events can lead to something transformative. Years from now, I imagine we'll tell the story to grandkids or new residents who might complain about trivial HOA mandates. We'll say, "You think that's bad? Let me tell you about the time the HOA burned down a treehouse and ended up getting sued by the fire department." The shock alone will make them realize that, yes, it can get that ridiculous, and yes, there's always a chance for redemption and growth if enough reasonable people stand up for what's right. Because in the end, that's what we learned. Communities are a patchwork of personalities, some more controlling than others, but the well-being of the place depends on neighbors who remain vigilant, open-minded, and kind-hearted. Our family story might have begun in fire and frustration, but it ended with a quiet transformation. A trunk reborn as an emblem of hope in a neighborhood that, for all its flaws, finally remembered what it means to truly look out for one another.